Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to our webinar series, and thanks for joining us this morning for what is now going to be webinar number 36 in our webinar series. So Stephen McCormick is my name. I'm a project executive with IrBEA, and I'm taking on the role of the host for this morning's session. Now today we'll be looking at the new Irish solid fuel regulations and what they mean in effect. Now, just before I begin, a little bit of background on IrBEA. So we were founded in 1999. We are the representative voice for the bioenergy sector here on the island of Ireland. We're a membership organisation with a diverse range of members, basically anyone with an interest in the bioenergy space. We cover the areas of biomass, biogas, biofuels, biochar, wood fuels and energy crops. We're also involved in policy, lobbying and advocacy on behalf of our members in the various different sectors. And we're largely funded through membership contributions as well as a number of research and demonstration projects. And these include the administration of the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme, a European Innovation Partnership project looking at small on-farm biogas demonstration, and Just Transition funded project looking at bioenergy business development in the Midlands region. And then finally, the 3C project looking at biochar, which I myself am directly involved in. Now, if you're interested in finding out more or becoming a member, I would encourage you to visit our website at irbea.org. Now, and then just to let you know, we plan on having our next webinar this day, 2 weeks' time, on the 23rd of November at the same time of 9:30, where our discussion will hopefully be on the topic of sustainable aviation fuel. Full details will be published through our communication channels and social media channels in the coming days. And then also just to draw your attention, this is just the latest in our webinar series, number 36. All of our previous sessions have been recorded and are available for playback to our YouTube channel. And they've also been linked to our website. Now, we've covered a wide range and varied range of topics to date, and so I'd encourage you to take a look back at any of the ones you might have missed. Now, on the agenda for today, today's session, a quick run through our agenda. In a moment, we'll be joined by my colleague and IrBEA technical executive, Noel Gavigan. And as mentioned, the topic is on the recently introduced solid fuels regulation. Noel will present on some of the details and what this means for consumers and for the industry. And then just as usual, you can submit any questions you might have through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll endeavour to try and get through as many of them as possible at the end during our panel discussion. And then just also before we begin, I'd just like to draw your attention to an IrBEA series of events that's happening between now and Christmas. So the focus is on solid biomass, and we call it the Solid Biomass Event Series. And what they are in effect is seminars in different spots around the country, followed by site visits to working solid biomass systems. And so, as you can see there, there's one on the 17th of November, which is next week. There's one on the 22nd and the 6th. Now, all attendees who registered this morning will receive details of this via email after the presentations. But if you're interested, you can stay tuned to our social media channels. There'll be full details published. Now, just a quick overview of our topic. Now, as many of you might be aware, as of the 31st of October this year, new legislation was introduced and passed and came into effect by the government to regulate the supply of solid fuels here in Ireland. Now, the scheme is designed to protect air quality. These regulations will ensure that only quality dried certified wood fuels are placed on the market. And then IrBEA, on behalf of wood fuel members, has been seeking the introduction of this regulation for several years in order to protect the market from inferior quality and wet wood fuel products. Now, the introduction of the solid fuel regulations has implications for the sale and supply of solid fuels for both producers and consumers. And then just with that introduction, I'd ask Noel to turn on his camera and get ready to share his presentation. I'll just stop sharing here now.
No, thanks very much for that, Stephen. I'll just share this. No. Now, is that showing okay there, Stephen?
Yeah, I just can see, yeah, perfect. That's it. Away we go.
Okay, so first of all, thanks to everyone for joining us this morning. These regulations are something that we've been anticipating for some time and have been working towards. So I'll just give you a small bit of background to why the regulations are there, our involvement in getting them in place, and what the regulations actually mean on the ground. Now, this is all focused, all of the regulations cover various fuels, all solid fuels, including coal products. This is purely focused on the 100% biomass area, which is what our organization is about. and wood fuel quality assurance scheme is about. Now, we do cover blended products as well, but predominantly this is in terms of the 100% biomass material. So just a small bit of background. Look, the evidence is quite clear in terms of why we have these regulations. It's about reducing the impact on air quality, and improving air quality is a critical factor. So there's been lots of different pieces of research done on this over the years, but effectively there's two ways of reducing emissions that are most effective. One is using drier materials. So you can see these two different versions of fuel being put in. Been put into a boiler or into a stove, where you can see on both situations, whether it's an old insert or a modern stove, you get a reduction in emissions by putting in drier material. So this regulation is all about putting drier material on the market, and the drier it is, the better. Now, there's lots of other information available on this. The appliance is also important, and we've already got the eco design label requirement for all stoves in the country. So you can see, compared to a fireplace or a wood stove, reducing an old style wood stove, fireplaces were the worst in terms of emissions of particulates. But when you go to an eco design stove, you bring it right down. And in terms of pellet stoves, you can see some variation between the different appliances there, but there's a lot of potential there within pellet stoves to bring emissions down even further. But generally, with eco design stoves with dry material, and that they're properly maintained, and that the operator knows how to use them correctly, you will reduce emissions dramatically. So that's really where the EU is going on this, and it's seen as a critical fuel going forward. This is just a small bit of piece of research that was done in UCD a couple of years ago, and it was using a standard multi-fuel stove, which is not optimized for timber use, but it was interesting to see the results in this. You can see, just to explain this graph, you have the particulate matter, your smoke emissions on the vertical. So the higher up, the worse it is. And then you have the NOx emissions on the horizontal. So they're further away from your 0 point here. Obviously, the more emissions you have. All of the wood fuels, as you can see, are bunched down in the bottom left-hand corner, with the lowest PM emissions and the lowest nitrous oxide emissions. So you can see all the peat products, some of the smokeless coal, as you can see, is generally bunched in around here. Bituminous coal is close by to that. And you can see the peat briquettes and sod peat, as you can see, quite a lot of emissions in terms of particulates, are very high emissions. So you can see where the conversion, even just changing the fuel type, can make a dramatic difference. You'll see here as well the blue tabs. These are wood that is wet, and you can see that it has an impact on particulate. So obviously, drier material, you will reduce your emissions considerably by doing so. Another piece we've done. Sorry, one moment now. This graph, which we produced based on EU data from the EMEP, basically, I would just transcribe the information from that and put it into this. Some of the information from emissions we've taken from the grid. But this is, if you're looking at heating the average home here in Ireland, ultimately, we can say we're focusing down on trying to get zero emissions. The less impact, the better, obviously. We have put all the different heating options in this, from kerosene to gas, heat pumps, pellet stoves, eco-design stoves, and then your open fireplace over here to the right. And effectively on this, you have your basically how many kilograms of CO2 it'll take per year to heat that house using the different technologies, and the kilograms of particulate matter that'll be released over the same period, 1 year. So you can see there, obviously, your kerosene is quite high, as highest on CO2. I haven't put coal in this. Coal actually goes way off the chart. So we haven't put that in. It's just condenses the chart down completely, and it goes off in both directions, both in terms of CO2 emissions and particulates. So it's way off up to the top right-hand corner off screen. So you can see there that kerosene is obviously bad in terms of CO2. You can see your open fire is bad in terms of particulates, but the closer you get to zero, the better. You can see our eco-design stoves and pellets stoves work out very well. We are CO2 reduction, we can see through heat pumps is coming down. This figure here is based on the average grid emissions, which is currently in the low 300s, I believe. It has varied. This summer has been quite high, and over the last year it's gone back up quite a bit. But the aim is to get to under 200 by 2030. So you can see there you'll have a little over 1,000 kilograms of CO2, 1,100 approximately kilograms of CO2. And if you bring down to pellet stoves, you're at about 400 eco-design stoves with firewood. you're down to maybe, was that 200, 250, somewhere in around that. It's not even 250. So it just gives you an idea of the impact our heating has in terms of, and how we can lessen those, and how the different technologies vary on that. Now, in terms of the call for regulation, we've been calling for regulation of firewood for many years. The WFQA was set up by our membership back in 2009, and has steadily grown since, and taken on many new both suppliers, but also many new IDs in terms of regulation and control. So our first official call on this, apologies, this is moving a bit the wrong direction. Our first official piece on this was in April of 2019, when we wrote this report, and we're approaching the department in terms of putting in emission control, or putting in moisture controls. We've always been calling for 25%, and that is in line with the European standard, the ISO standard on firewood. So we've always called for under 25 and possibly going to under 20, and that has been something we've been doing since the start. This is a much more detailed report we produced later on that year, in October of 2019, so 3 years ago. And within that, we set out a timeline. And one of the timelines is actually, we were saying to see the regulation come in by the 1st of September 2022. We didn't think we'd be that accurate in terms of predicting when it could actually come in. But it just shows the enthusiasm that the department had in terms of getting this properly regulated and put in place. Later on that year, there was a number of we start to see headlines coming out in terms of bans on turf and other smoky fuels. A lot of you would have seen the debate in terms of turf would have been the one that really got into the media, and got certain politicians in Ireland over that. So there was that's where you would have mainly seen it. But this had a big impact on our industry, and something that we were welcoming in terms of getting proper regulation in there, and to take the bad fuels off the market. We've seen a lot of wet materials out there which have caused a lot of harm. So we're only delighted to see that being moved off. So the solid fuel regulations, then there was a lot of negotiations over the last couple of years that have been set up. They're in place. So effectively, it's an add-on to the Air Pollution Act 1987, which is basically the smoke, what most of us know as the smoky coal ban. So initially that was set up in different urban areas. It's now, what is different about the new regulations from 2022 are a little bit more, a number of changes in there. So first of all, it sets requirements for use of fuels for domestic heating. And it's critical, it's domestic, it's not industrial. So it's basically materials that are put for sale for use in domestic, and also actually licensed premises. So if you have an open fire in a pub, basically, or a stove in a pub, it also is in for covers that area too. So first of all, these new regulations, the first thing to do is to introduce a nationwide ban on the use of smoky coal. They're introducing a nationwide ban on open trading of turf. There still can be some certain level of trading, but open trading is now gone. We're not going to go too much into detail on that. But critically for the firewood, briquettes and pellet, it's the first time that we've seen the introduction of regulations on the quality of wood products for domestic use. And as I said, this is something we've been calling for. So we're happy to see that. There's certain things we would like to see improved, let's just say, but overall, the requirement is something that we would see as very adequate. So, and there will be some needs for some changes in time to come. So within the regulations itself, we see that sometimes regulations boil down to single sentences, and the central sentence on this is that a person shall not retail or distribute solid fuel for the purposes of combustion for heating in a fireplace in a domestic or licensed premises that is not an approved solid fuel. Now, what is different about that is, or what the difference in that is that is for any solid fuel. It's no longer focused on coal or coal products. It basically applies to any solid fuel that is in the marketplace, or that can be put in the marketplace, and that is focused on the supply of heat for domestic use, predominantly. Licensed premises added into that as well. So it's quite clear. It's very easy to interpret. It's very difficult to misinterpret. It sets the requirement there very clearly. Now, critically in that as well, and I'll go through some of the other requirements, the fact that it means all fuels, even if you're, which just on the next criteria, I'll show where that's important. The other thing on this, in terms of, it says in a fireplace, the fireplace is defined under the Act as well as any furnace, incinerator, grate or stove. So basically it's not just an open fireplace, it's any place where any device, appliance that can burn these materials is considered. So the critical part on this in terms of biomass, it says that fuel products which are 100% biomass product, including wood products and wood logs, supplied in units of 2 cubic meters or less, must have a moisture content of less than 25%. This is exactly what we were calling for, and we've been calling for at some date in the future for that to go down to less than 20. Again, just to bring the emissions down even further. So under 25 will have a dramatic impact, especially when you've seen material out there at 40% and higher. So it will be considerable, and then bring it down under 20 will improve it better still. There's not much difference when you go under 20. Timber tends to burn very efficiently in smaller appliances. You don't need to go any lower than that. In actual fact, when you go down to really dry material, you can start to see certain things like nitrates starting to increase again. So there's a sweet spot there, and once you're under 20, you're in the best range for that. Now, it's very important to point out this is just for domestic. This does not count for wood chip or materials that you might use in an industrial setting. Those boilers are able to work very effectively with material that is a lot wetter and can do so while keeping the emissions down and eliminate them. So it's important that you understand that this is for smaller appliances that would struggle with wetter material. Now, one of the requirements they've put into this is that wood logs supplied in units of more than 2 cubic meters shall be accompanied by a notice that they have basically in the Act itself. Effectively, what that does is it allows a supplier under the Act to supply material greater than 25% if to supply sufficient volume, and basically the Schedule 2 is where they're giving the consumer advice on how to dry it themselves. So that's basically put in so that you could sell a trailer load of material to somebody local who wants to stock it themselves and dry it themselves over the course of the summer, say. Now, but it gives advice. It doesn't actually put a lot of control. You could buy stuff today and burn it today. You could fill your shed today with material that's not suitable and burn it. So we have never, under the WFQA, endorsed that sort of material. So we don't certify somebody to supply material above 25%. So from that point of view, there's a bit of an anomaly in between ourselves and the regulation, but we will be standing very strongly on what we believe that maintaining that all firewood produced and solid fuels produced for domestic use should be under 25%. This is not an issue when you look at pellets. Pellets are all at 8%. And well, under 10 is the requirement, but generally you see them between 7-8%. That's where they're produced best, and they hold their consistency best. So it's not an issue there at all. This regulation does cover pellet, but it's generally not going to be an issue. What is important to note though on this is that even where somebody is supplying material above 2 cubic meters, if they are looking at, rather than going for this point here, if they decide we want to sell this material, they still have to be registered under the Act. It must still be an approved fuel. They can't just decide, well, we won't get we won't register, we won't go on the fuel register, we'll just supply material in larger volumes and stay off the book, so to speak. That you can't do that under this Act. You are required, regardless of the moisture content of the material you sell, to be registered. So that's a very important point for anybody that's considering their options on this. The second piece then is, I suppose there's a number of different requirements. One of them is on the producer. So if you're a firewood producer, a briquette producer, a wood pellet producer, you are required to register annually on the fuel register. And the fuel register itself is maintained by the EPA. Now I have another slide on that in a few minutes. But you are required to register on that on an annual basis. You are also required to hold a valid certificate of compliance from a relevant quality assurance scheme. So that can be obtained from ourselves in the WFQA. And that basically shows that you are able to maintain material that's compliant with the regulations. So we would go and audit people for various parameters on that. The critical, we look at sustainability, we look at labelling, which is also involved in this Act. But the critical thing is the quality of the material itself, that it's under 25% for firewood. Briquette, we don't have a specific requirement on that, but briquettes would need to be produced at a very dry level, under 15% as a minimum, because if not, they will break apart. So there's no real argument in terms of pellet or briquette. If the stuff gets too wet, it won't hold together, so it needs to stay dry. And if not, it'll no longer be a pellet. It'll no longer be a briquette. So it tends to be there's not much need for much argument on that. But it is critical that you hold a certificate of compliance and that you're audited on that. The requirement is on the producer to ensure that the fuel conforms to the regulations. So it's not on the certifier, it's not on somebody else. It is on the producer of that fuel to ensure that they meet the requirements. The requirement being that 25% and going down to 20 in 2025. So that's where the requirement lies. A certification scheme or a quality assurance scheme is basically going through your procedures, ensuring that you have the wherewithal to maintain that quality, that you are doing so, and that you've proven that you are capable of doing so. So the next thing, a requirement on the producer, is that they must label all of their products as directed. Again, I'll go into that, have another slide, and that the next slide is on looking at how you're labeling your products. It is critical that you maintain good labeling. It's critical that those labels are adhered to the bag, and it's a separate matter, but it does have an effect in that we have a plant passporting, which also needs to carry a label on the outside of a bag. So both of those, although they're two completely separate pieces of regulation, are both coming into play at the one time. So it's actually an opportune time for people to get their bags labeled correctly and not have to go to the expense of having to relabel after a period of time. So the other thing that it's required of producers is, so on that label, you must have your EPA registration number, and we'll go through those labeling requirements. The other thing is you have to add notification on any advertisements, any leaflets, invoices, etc., that you are registered. You don't need to give your registration number in advertisements, but you are in any documentation required to put down your registration number to show that, and somebody could, I would expect, go online and check that out and see that you are registered. And more to the point, anyone that's enforcing it could go and check to see that you are compliant, or that you are registered. The last one then is that you must keep records for 6 years. There's a number of other requirements within the regulations. There's no number of requirements we would have within the WFQA as well, but they're the critical ones that we think are most important for people to note at this point in time. And it's for the consumer, it's important that they're able to see that what they're buying is conforming. And for the retailer, which I'll go through in a minute, it's also important for them to be able to, they have requirements under the law on this as well. So the label will allow them to ensure that what they have is adhering to the law from their point of view. So as I said earlier, in terms of the labeling requirements, any advertisements, dockets and invoices, they are required to make the statement that you're a registered fuel producer on the fuels register. And with the producer's registration displayed on documentation, not on advertisements. Any radio advertisements will also have to make that statement that you are registered on the fuel register. The fuel labels themselves must contain the text that the contents comply with the Air Pollution Act regulations, and you must also put in the regulation numbered by the EPA. So it's a relatively simple requirement, and it just shows that what you've got is correct. We would have requirements under the WFQA for other matters such as the moisture content and other factors in there as well. But that's the critical one for these regulations. In terms of the retailer, and we've noted that the local authorities have written out to, I don't know if all of the local authorities have, but quite a number of them have written out to retailers across their respective counties and informed them that they must inform them of the requirements under this new regulation. So basically the key points in that are that a retailer shall not retail any solid fuel from a producer that is not registered on the fuel register. So if they want to stock fuel, they have to ensure that the person supplying it is registered on the fuels register. That is their requirement. So this is what the councils have been written out to them and saying. And they are not to make available any fuel that is not an approved fuel. So you'll see when I go into the fuels register itself, you have to list off the different fuels that you're providing to have them approved. but the retailer must ensure that it's an approved fuel. That goes down to, this is where the labeling is very important for them. They can see it is properly labeled, they can see the registration number on that, and it gives the retailer comfort that the product they have is correct, and they're complying with the regulations by ensuring that. So they're also required to keep records for a year of any fuels distributed. So they have to take a record of material that comes in, they have to take a record of material that is sold. And it's again just part of ensuring that there is some traceability in all this, and that if there is an audit, they're all required. Each of these people, which I haven't written in this, so whether you're a producer, whether you're a retailer, whether you're transporting, you must provide any information that an authority asks for in terms of complying with these regulations. So it would be the enforcer is going to be the local authorities in this, and we might discuss that later. So and the last slide I have really on this is the fuels register itself. The regulation here is relatively simple in total. It's a relatively short document. There's not a lot of information in it that needs to be. It's not overly encumbersome that way. So the first thing on the fuel register, it's the EPA is the administrator of the fuel register. So you go to the EPA website and you register with them on their fuel register. There's a 2-page application form. You have to put down lots of different information, which we'll go through here in a minute. But it is the EPA is the authority. That fuel register is in existence for several years. All of the coal product suppliers have had to be registered on that for several years now. I'm not quite sure how far it goes back. It's possibly to the original act. But I would expect it probably is. But that has been in existence for several years. It has only been possible for somebody in producing a biomass product to register since, I've written down later on, 28th of October of this year. The minister signed this into law on the 20th. It wasn't possible for the EPA to even consider it until the minister had signed it. And so on the 20th of October, the minister signed the act. And from that point forward, the EPA will put in process the registration details. As I said, the 2022 regulation, it adds biomass fuels for the first time, but it also adds a fee of €100 per year for the first time. This wasn't the case up to this point and up to now. And this is now set in the regulation that there is a fee that must be paid to the EPA along with the registration. So the form opened for registration on the 28th of October. You'll note that the regulation came into force on the 31st. So it wasn't actually possible for somebody to register, get the EPA to send out the registration number, and then for them to go labeling the bags. So we have held a series of discussions and meetings with both the department and the EPA on this. And in terms of, look, there's a lead time on bags, there's a lead time on labeling, up to 6 months for depending on the quantities and what's getting done. So they are offering certain leeway for in terms of labeling, that all bags will need to be labeled. That's going to be pushed out into next year. But they are giving there is a need to register though as a fuel supplier. So at the moment they're giving up to the 31st of December for fuel suppliers to register. We are going to discuss that with them because there's quite a number of people who have not been registered at all before in the biomass area, and particularly firewood, and they need to register. There's quite a bit of work for them to do to get in their compliance in order before they can register. So it's possibly going to take longer than the 31st of December for the vast majority of suppliers to be registered and to be fully compliant. So we are going to talk to the EPA about that. The main requirements, apart from that, are you must register annually with the EPA by the 1st of September. So it's renew your registration each year. There's a number of smaller requirements, such as if you add in new fuels and all that, you must notify them within I think 14 days. You must on that application list all the fuel types. So if you have various different biomass products or any fuel products, you must list them all, and you must provide a valid certificate of compliance for meeting the requirement. So that certificate of compliance will basically come from the likes of the WFQA. If you're in pellets, it's the WFQA and the EN+. So it's but that is where the requirement will come from. So that's basically the regulation. It's not overly complex. It's relatively easy to understand. As I said, it is a welcome development to have put in place. It's something that we have been calling for. That there is certain things we, as an industry, would say should be improved, but this is a first step. Definitely the allowance of material above 25% when you provide larger quantities, we would have issue with that. In terms of, I do think it's opening a door, but the fact that those suppliers will have to register anyway will add in additional a barrier for them actually doing so. So, but there's also where the standard itself does not require someone to meet the European standard or the internationally recognized standard 17225. We think, although it gets a mention for certain things like testing moisture content, for example, and it gets referenced for certain things, we think that that is the de facto standard. It's been negotiated and worked on for several decades by hundreds of different experts across all European states. And it is a very robust standard for not just your solid fuels for domestic use, but for all solid fuels for industrial and right across the biomass spectrum, from wood pellets to straw bales. They actually have requirements written out and described in detail, so that you can look at any biomass product and consider how it could be certified and how it can be detailed up. So that's where it stands. Look, in terms of the WFQA, we have we're actively certifying people there at the moment and have been doing for over 10 years. It is managed and administered by ourselves in IrBEA. So we have a map. It just needs a little bit of updating because we have a number of new suppliers. We've 40 plus suppliers now registered with the WFQA and certified through the WFQA. So the map is online. If you want to go online and have a look at that, you'll see the various suppliers we have around the country, and you can find a local supplier for whether it's wood chip, firewood, wood pellet, or briquette. As I said, we certify only to ISO 17225. So for that reason, there is a mismatch between that and the regulation and this 2 cubic meters rule, which I said, we're not in favor of, but the regulation is a very good first step, and we're delighted to see it in place. So the WFQA covers it overtly so on that. So we will also in terms of the SRH, or in terms of industrial boilers, we cover the supply of fuels for that, which is usually wood pellet or wood chip. So we certify to that, which is important for anyone that's looking for the SRH. And there's sustainability criteria in there as well. So that's basically it. It's relatively short in terms of describing it. It's not, as I said, it's not the most complex piece of regulation. And there's various short documents on it, both from the EPA and from the regulation itself. So back to yourself, Stephen, if you're there.
I am indeed, Noel, yep. That's perfect. Well, thanks very much for your presentation. I'll just remind our attendees that they can submit any questions that they might have through the question and answers tab there at the bottom of the screen. But yeah, thanks, Noel, for a very interesting presentation. Look, as you noted, we've kind of been calling for some sort of formal regulation on the supply of wet wood since 2019. So I presume you're delighted to have seen it passed and to see the fact that they've come into effect. And obviously, it's only last week that they've come into effect, so we've yet to see the practical implications, but you've kind of given a good outline as to what they might be in terms of requirements on the producers and the retailers. With regards the retailers, I suppose one thing that we didn't touch on, or that your presentation didn't cover, is there, so they have to register all the types of solid fuel that they're, say, in a forecourt of a petrol station. Is there anything determining whether they need to have appropriate storage, for example? So say if they take delivery of dry wood, I've often seen bags of wet wood sitting outside of the forecourt. Is there anything within the regulations?
There's actually not, no. It's a good point. There's nothing on that you're required. I suppose if there's a regulation around other products, your loaf of bread or sugar, I don't know if there's a regulation on how you maintain it, but it's a product that's, you have to protect it from the weather. But it would actually probably have made some sense if they'd done something on that level, that they must maintain it in a manner that's compliant with the regulation. So I'm in going through it now, maybe there is something in that I hadn't noticed, but as far as I'm aware, there's nothing detailing that, which would be important.
Yeah. Okay, well, I see a number of questions here that are coming in. So we want to hear from Michael. So he says he runs a small firewood enterprise selling air dried, so below 20% moisture, hardwood to friends and neighbors. So his annual sales between 2,000 and 4,000. Does he need to register and obtain a certificate? And if so, what would the annual cost be? So I think you've kind of addressed the certificate is €100 per year. Is that correct?
It's the EPA side of it is to register on the fuel register is €100 per year, but you need to be audited and get a certificate of compliance. So that's would be through the WFQA. So there is basically, if someone contacts us in that, we can look at the quantity that they're doing and detail out what it would actually cost. It is going to be harder for smaller suppliers, without a doubt, because there is in order to meet the requirements, you have to go and audit a site. You have to test the material itself. So there's quite a lot of requirements on it in terms of getting it in place. So it is going to for the smaller supplier, it is going to be more difficult, and especially if they're doing a small bit for themselves and a few people are close by. It's a little bit different when they're dealing with several lorry loads a year, but the smaller supplier will be more difficult.
Okay. And Michael, if you want to get in touch with ourselves afterwards, you can feel free to do so. We can talk you through that. Another question here from Tomas. So is the regulation going to be enforced on the ground? So he said he's currently registering for plant passports, but at the moment the enforcement isn't quite where it should be, maybe. And so who will be responsible for enforcement, essentially? I think you mentioned it was probably the local authority. Is that correct?
Yes, so the local authority are charged with that. At the moment, and we work, as we were setting, these regulations are being set up, the department did ask us in terms of what requirements could be there for testing and for sampling. So we, again, put them onto the 17225 because it has got all the different, all these things are worked out in terms of how you should sample biomass product, how we should test it. So they were looking to put a guide together for that. So we, I believe, it went out and they have acquired an expert on that area. So we declined to do that piece of work because it wasn't appropriate for us to be actually playing both sides of the same fence, you could say. So we suggested that they would hire an expert to put together some guidelines for the local authorities. So the local authorities, look, they're getting up to speed on this. It'll take some time. We, for example, we've heard of one local authority saying it must be kiln dried, which is wrong. It does no requirement to kiln dry material, and it's no advantage to kiln dry it once you can get it to the right requirement. In fact, kilns are very useful for suppliers, but obviously you have an energy cost, and when you're having to put energy into something, there's going to be some carbon footprint or some impact. Otherwise, you need additional material to do so. So where the cheapest and most environmentally friendly way to dry material is actually air drying. So for that reason, you don't need to kiln dry material. So the local authorities are getting up to speed. It's a new regulation. It's going to take a little bit of time, bedding in time for them to get it in place. As I said, they have been writing out to retailers, and we've seen some of the letters that have gone out. I'd like to see more of them. Actually, it's interesting to see how they're differing from each other. And but they will be putting people on the ground on this.
Okay, and I suppose as a follow-on to that question, so these regulations obviously only apply to the Republic now. IrBEA, obviously, you're an all-Ireland representative body, but what's to prevent potentially people going north of the border to pick up fuel and bring it back down? Will that fuel then be covered by Irish regulations once it crosses the border, or
if to go and pick it up themselves, literally themselves? I don't know if there's anything in the regulation on to stop that, but if you are hiring somebody to haul it, or if somebody is transporting material, there is specific requirements on anybody transporting solid fuels. That they must ensure that the solid fuel meets the requirements. So you can't, you could possibly go with your own car and trailer and pick up stuff. I actually have to read through it with that in mind to see if you could, but that'll only suit a very small number of people, even if it was the case. But whereas before we did have issues, well, not so much ourselves, but I know in the coal side of things, they had issues with people bringing in material from other jurisdictions, and they could do so without any issue. this regulation clamps down on that in the fact that anyone transporting a solid fuel. So there's requirements on the retailer, there's requirements on the producer, and there's requirement on anyone transporting. So that should shut that door completely.
Okay, very good. Okay, we have another question here then. So is moisture content defined as a percentage of total weight or dry weight? Moisture content of 25% total weight is moisture content of 33% dry weight basis.
Yes, they happened actually. Sharp eye caught that actually, because they happened to find that in the requirements. Most materials are defined as against the wet weight. So what that means is, I suppose, just for the listener, if you have a kilogram of firewood, say, and I just use firewood as the example, if you have a kilogram of firewood and it's, let's just say, 50% water, okay, it's not firewood at that point, it's too wet, but you have material 50% water, 50% dry matter, timber, you would call that, in a wet weight basis, it's 50% water. However, if you do it in a dry weight basis, what you're doing is you're dividing the dry weight into the wet weight into the dry weight. You would actually call that 100% water, because you've 100% of the weight that's in water is directly equal to what's in dry matter. It's slightly confusing. It does make quite a bit of difference. But the standard, interesting, in carpentry, they tend to use one way of measuring it, which is slightly confusing, because in all energy contents, energy requirements, they tend to use the other, which is the wet weight basis. So their figure will appear slightly smaller. So they don't define that within the regulation, which was an oversight, which would make more sense if they did. But those requirements are there. They're also, look, those requirements that they have, they are identical to the UK requirements, which where some of this information, say like even the 2 cubic meters would come from UK regulation. But we'd set out a lot of details in terms of 25% and the 20%. But yeah, in terms of the moisture content, it's they don't define the method by which it's done.
Okay, so Tommy, you're right in saying that it's ambiguous in the legislation at the moment. Question here from John, just to confirm that you can register with the EPA and then sell wet wood in quantities over 2 cubic meters. So that refers to that category that you were mentioning.
Well, you can register with the EPA, but you need a certificate of compliance. The WFQA rules, I audit for the WFQA, they don't allow me to issue a certificate of compliance for somebody that's supplying material over 25%. So there would be a question of where somebody will get their certificate of compliance to meet that regulation.
Okay, so yeah, so that there shouldn't be too many instances of that taking place.
Yeah, they possibly could get it registered with some European scheme or something else. If it's, that's something else that might be in existence, and like it's open to, the WFA doesn't have a monopoly on this, and nor should it. But it's de facto it's the only standards in operation in the country. So we don't, as it stands, certify to anything above 25%. You must provide it below 25. So therefore, you could look to register with the EPA, but you won't be able to get a cert of compliance from us anyway, for now. Okay. And we've no plans on changing that.
Okay. And we have another one here from Michael. So another example, I guess this refers to his earlier question of contradictory government policies in terms of farm forestry. So he's just saying that people were encouraged to plant forestry, but then regulated out of selling small amounts of their output. So obviously it's just a follow-up to the impact on smaller producers and how this might prove problematic in terms of costs associated with it, or the regulatory requirements that might be a little bit more cumbersome for smaller producers to deal with.
Well, it's a good point in terms of, particularly somebody's using their own material. There is no restriction on somebody using their own. So if you've got forestry and you want to supply your own house with heating from material from that, absolutely you can do so without because you're not retailing material. It's not an issue. In terms of going into quantities, if you're looking to sell to some neighbours, yeah, you would need to be registered. Now, possibly there is a need to look at very small suppliers in another round of the regulation in terms of what's going on with turf sellers at the moment. You can sell to a neighbour or a friend or something like that. So there is some ambiguity in that area. So perhaps there could be looked at something there, but generally just to try and capture. I mean, look, ultimately what we're trying to do here is lower moisture contents, get the material that's being combusted at the right level, so that it's more efficient. It's less, you're not producing the pollutants. It's better for your stove. It's better for everything. It makes no sense to be burning wet material. So perhaps there is a need to look at something on the farm forestry side of it. We've seen the new forestry grants come out this week, which are very generous. So it'll be interesting to see, and it also looks at smaller plots. And we do think that having farms growing small plots for their own supply, or even for a family member or two, would be very beneficial overall, because it will encourage farmers to have a small plantation on farms. So in itself, and these things could only be of benefit, of use.
Okay. Question here from Noel. So great advice keeping fuel dry, but if customers are not informed on the best way to store their fuel, so as you said, buying a bag of wet log from the garage, should there not be information on best storage solutions and the problem, what happens with wrong storage? So again, that comes down to having dry timber, and then I guess or dry wood fuels, and then getting wet by being stored outside in porous bags. So guidance documents on how to keep your fuel dry, I suppose, would be beneficial.
Yeah, they don't say, there's nothing about that in the regulation. We do have it as a rule of the WFQA. You must have that information in that written in the bag, in terms of the importance of keeping it dry, but it's not in the regulation itself. So look, a guidance note on that is probably something we could produce ourselves. It would be for general consumers, it would be no harm anyway. But look, the questioner is correct. Like, keeping it dry is critical, and we've seen places where people are buying dry material and it's been left out in the rain. Shops in particular, where you might see it. Although most of them are much better at that now. But they're used to maybe leaving coal bags out in the rain and without an issue, and that firewood and products like that don't lend itself to that.
Okay. Now we have a question here. So as a forest owner who's sells thinnings from his wood or her wood every few years, about 3 to 4 meters long, timber is stacked in the barn for 2 to 3 years and then blocked as required. So does that person need to register? They want to know, they'll have to do more thinnings next year, and would they need to register if they're only selling a small amount? So again, I guess if they're looking to sell, I guess they need to register. Isn't that correct?
Well, I think what is selling thinnings rather than 3 to 4 meter lengths, that's not firewood. So if he's selling it in 3 to 4 meter lengths, that's
well, then he's saying, he goes on to say he stacks it then for 2 to 3 years and then blocks it as required, so chops it into blocks as required. So
well, if he's selling the way the regulations are, if he's selling what is a fuel, and selling it as a fuel, yes, he will have to meet the requirements.
Yeah. Okay.
He will have to register.
Yeah. Okay. And then another question here: can you explain the difference in the WFQA certification as opposed to the Woodsure certification?
The Woodsure is a UK scheme. It is in place, but it doesn't cover a lot of things we would cover that are required. So look, I'm not sure the details of the Woodsure scheme, but it's a scheme that is in operation in the UK. Look, we know our WFQA scheme quite well, and it's been developed by Irish suppliers and ourselves, and it's something that we know it's worked alongside the regulation here.
Okay. So I think that's most of our questions for the moment. I suppose I just wanted to come back to, you mentioned sort of the importance of, or the benefits essentially of using sort of the new, more modern appliances in terms of burning this material. Obviously, the eco-design stoves, that legislation has been in place for the last number of years, but maybe not everyone is aware of it. But obviously, the old open fires is the least efficient way of basically consuming your wood fuels. So maybe just outline a bit about the more modern stoves and just how they're becoming more popular, I guess, across Europe in particular.
Yeah, and it's we see various grant aids being available across Europe for different appliances. So look, the new eco-design stove, we're all used to. Fireplaces obviously have been there for forever. People start putting in stoves in recent years. Stoves have been around for quite some time in various forms, but they were originally multi-fuel stoves, so you could put in coal, you could put in timber, you could put in turf. They were able to cater for all that and burn all that, but they wouldn't have done so very efficiently. and they would also produce quite a lot of particulate matter, and so they weren't the cleanest. So the new eco-design stoves, I mean, it's almost like a petrol and diesel engine at this stage in terms of you can get an eco-design stove that'll burn some of your coal products or your low smoke coal products. You can get an eco-design stove that'll burn timber products, but you won't be able to mix one with the other. You know, it's because the two products burn very, very differently. Generally, you're looking at one stove will burn one fuel and the other stove will burn another fuel. So because of the way they've refined the combustion chambers and how they've, like timber, for example, you tend not to use much what they call primary air coming up from underneath with timber. It doesn't need it. And you have an awful lot less ash coming out of timber. You will find that like if you're just burning timber alone, you won't need a grate. You don't put a grate in the bottom. You see any of these eco-design stoves, they tend not to have a grate. You leave an ash bed build up in the bottom, and you need to clean out ashes maybe at most, you know, probably a tenth of the time as you would for a coal or a peat product, because there's far less ash, there's far less mineral material in the fuel itself. So therefore, you know, you've less. You don't need a grate. You can refine it to basically burn timber product much greater, and you get much higher efficiency. So the eco-design has changed the way we look at stoves and in terms of what can actually happen there. But we would see it now, the requirements for eco-design, you can't go in and buy a multi-fuel stove anymore. They come in January of this year, that all stoves must be eco-design. Shop owners since last summer knew very much about it and knew what was involved. And look, they're very efficient. They're not, there might be additional costs, but not an awful lot. And especially in terms of the efficiency. And we see a lot of people now looking at in terms of to have the efficiency of fuel. We see the cost of fuel going up, although we see the wood fuels have not gone up anywhere near where fossil fuels have gone up. So it's interesting to see where renewables are now that much cheaper than fossil, which was the other way around several years ago. And a lot of people are choosing that as an option to put in an eco-design stove, burn timber and use it. You're lowering your carbon, lowering your heating costs, and you know, there's a lot of benefits from it. So it's becoming, we're seeing it we're seeing quite a lot of there.
That's great. I see another follow-on question to the question about the wood cert. So to your knowledge, are you aware whether the wood cert will cover you to sell it in the Republic of Ireland? So
I'm not aware. It's a UK scheme, so I'm not aware if it does. So
okay, so that's maybe something we can check into and see if there's any clarity on that. I might just throw up just I alluded to it at the start, just that you're running a series of solid biomass events in the coming weeks between now and Christmas. So I might just throw up the schedule there, and you might just outline basically the intention behind them, and just in case anyone is interested in find out more details and who are interested in the whole area of solid biomass. So this is the schedule of events. Says it. Yep. Can you see that there, Noel? Yeah.
I can, yeah. So basically, whereas these regulations that we're discussing have all been about domestic fuels, and it's literally set out in the legislation, and something we had to work a lot on the wording to ensure it was only for domestic fuels. The other area, which is a big area for the WFQA and for IrBEA, is industrial and commercial heat usage. So we're running a series of events starting this month, and we're going to run it into next year. We're looking at doing a lot of events over the course of next year in terms of commercial premises. So we're looking at the first three examples, which are one is burning, two are burning chip, one is burning pellet, and basically these ones are the first one is a shopping centre, which we're looking at in Mullingar. And it's got a 2,000 kilowatt wood chip boiler, so it's in operation a couple of years. And again, very easy way for somebody like that to decarbonize, and the cost savings that they would have seen over the past 12 months, I would say would be eye-watering in terms of where oil and gas prices have gone, and wood chip we've seen has seen very little difference. The second base we're going to is Lahinch Leisure Centre. So they have just installed a whole new heating system there. So they have two 500 kilowatt biomass boilers on site. They have some heat pump there as well, and they've put in solar PV. So they've seen their heating bills and their energy bills drop, I think, by about 50%. I forget. I've seen some of the base figures. We'll know more when we go and visit the site. But it's been an exceptionally good year to be involved in renewable energy when you see where costs have gone. And that's one very good example. And we're looking at these areas. These seminars are really based to look at different industries. So the hotel industry, the leisure industry, there's a number of farming sectors like poultry and pig, which uses a lot of heat. There's processing industries, which we're going to do later, starting in the first quarter of next year. So we have a number of large pharmaceutical plants. We have manufacturing plants and large food processing plants that use a lot of heat energy. And biomass is the lowest cost actually in terms of dispatchable heat and heat demand that you can, or heat that you can call on at any time. It's a very stable and solid source of heating. So we are running these events. They're predominantly focused on bringing in potential other hotel owners, other leisure center owners, other industries that are interested to learn about how they can use biomass. First of all, to lower their costs. Second of all, to lower their carbon emissions. And thirdly, it's a good guarantee on fuel security. We have ample supply of forestry material here in the country compared to what we're relying to 100% on fossil fuels practically. I know we have some gas off the west coast, but that's dwindling. So this is something that we know that the resources are there in our forestry sector. Again, the new forestry program should increase forestry planting, and that's that'll start producing material in 15 years' time. But there's ample amount of material that's been planted since 1990 onwards, and it lends itself to really seeing a lot of use here, as we're seeing a lot more interest in, say, timber housing, timber being used as a construction material because it's low carbon credentials. You can't cut timber without producing sawdust. You're producing more sawdust. All of that goes into, or most of it goes into wood pellet. So no matter what way you look at using your timber, you're going to have the byproduct. You're going to pulp wood coming off forestry. You're going to have the unsuitable wood that can be used again for chip. So there's we've done a lot of work on looking at the resources there. It's very much underutilized. And these events are geared towards those potential users. They don't necessarily need to know much about biomass. They won't really want to. And we'll be looking at things like ESCO contracts, where, to give the example of one of those sites, the hotel owner knows nothing about the boiler. We actually rang, we were booking. The people on reception didn't even know where the heat was coming from. They don't need to, because you have a contractor in, they look after the boiler, they fuel it, and you basically have a heat meter. So we're focusing those events towards the industrial user, and we're quite, we reckon these will be quite successful. And we're just starting off with 3. We're looking at a 4th one out later on in December, and then into next year where we start running a lot more of them. So
brilliant. Well, obviously, Teresa, who works away tirelessly behind the scenes, will to organise all our webinars. She'll be sending on the details of those, including registration links to all who attended today. So if they want to find out more, or indeed if they want to participate, they can get in touch with Teresa or yourself. Let me see now. I think that's all our questions in today. So our next one is scheduled, like I said before, for 2 weeks' time. And listen, I'd like to, again, thank Teresa behind the scenes for making this possible, and thanks to Noel for presenting on the topic. Thanks to all our attendees for joining us today and for your questions. If you have any follow-on questions, of course, you can reach out to a member of the team, and you can find our details on our website. So with that, we'll call it a day, and we'll hopefully see you again in 2 weeks' time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers.